Welcome to the Breech Birth Podcast. I'm Sasha Hopkins, private midwife, breech birth educator, and your host. This is a space to hear the real, raw, and powerful stories of women who have experienced breech birth in all its layers. Each episode features honest conversations with women who've experienced breech firsthand, offering insight and reflection. This podcast was born from the knowing that these stories need to be heard, to inform, connect, and reclaim the story of breech birth. Whether you're navigating breech birth yourself, supporting others, or simply curious, welcome and thank you. The Breech Birth Podcast is independently created and produced. If you'd like to support the continuation of this space, you can do so through Buy Me a Coffee. Your support helps keep these stories being shared and accessible to women and families around the world, and you can find the link in the show notes. Thank you for being a part of this community. Hi, Ali. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. Before we jump into your story, let's jump into our context questions. So whereabouts are you located?
Yeah, so I am in coastal South Carolina in America.
Amazing. And how many weeks were you when you had your breech baby?
I was 40 plus 6.
And what kind of care did you receive during your pregnancy for your birth?
I had mostly OB care with some midwife care towards the end.
Okay. And she had a vaginal birth or a cesarean?
Vaginal.
Amazing. So before we jump into your story, do you want to share just a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Sure. I am 33. I manage luxury boutique hotels here in South Carolina and pretty much work and then enjoy life by the ocean with my husband and my toddler and our new baby.
And so you had a baby before your breech baby. Before we jump into the breech story, can you give us just a little snapshot of your first experience, the pregnancy? So what kind of care you received and what that birth looked like?
Yeah, so my first baby, my son is 2 years old. He was not a breech baby. He was head down, and I received OB care for my entire pregnancy for him. And he was born in hospital. We did have a miscarriage before I got pregnant with him. So it was a little bit more of like a, I guess, at-risk pregnancy. There was a lot of visits and checkups and scans kind of along the way. And to my sort of regret, it was an induction. He was 40 plus 4. And, you know, I'm nearly 6 foot. My husband's over 6 foot. So the whole conversation about both babies was that they were measuring large. And that was a big factor in the plan for induction and sort of another topic of conversation in our most recent birth as well.
Okay. All right. Well, let's then jump into that then. So what's the age gap between your first and your second?
Almost exactly 2 years by a couple days.
Nice. So you can pair up their birthdays.
Exactly. 2 for 1.
And so what did the beginning of that pregnancy look like for you? And did you know that you wanted to go back to OB care? Were you looking at any other options?
Yeah, I sort of reverted back to the same OB. I really enjoyed our first experience with her for the most part. And, you know, everything was very healthy and normal for both pregnancies along the way. We went with her care, really the OB care, up until the time that we found out that the second baby was breech, at which point she sort of stated that she just wasn't trained or comfortable or able to assist with a breech birth. And just being in the US as well, there's a lot of red tape around what is allowed in hospitals for breech birth. So you're given that option of cesarean or figure it out. And so that's what we were presented with towards the end, at which point I did consult with a midwife.
Before we jump down that path, I just wanted to ask if you had had the 20-week ultrasound at all, and if baby was breech then. Or...
Yeah, he was breech the entire time. So in every ultrasound had confirmed breech. He was just comfortable where he was. And I think it was up until the 36 week mark where they were like, oh, it's not a problem. You know, you have time. It didn't really occur to me that it was going to be an issue. I just sort of thought, you know, first one flipped and this one I'm sure will flip too. Of course, he didn't. He was a stubborn one.
Did you get offered ECV at all?
Yes, that was something that was sort of new to me. Really, this whole breech topic was new. That was something that the ROB did offer me at 37 weeks. I think she said was sort of the latest and sort of the good timing that you want to do it, not too early, not too late. We ended up trying one at 38 weeks, was unsuccessful, and unmedicated as well. I've heard that that's sort of a topic of their success, but it was not pleasant at all. And I really wish that I hadn't done it in hindsight. Very, very uncomfortable, and some pain for the week after, very sore. Really just kind of felt bad for pushing on the little guy and trying, do that unnatural movement. I'm very much wanting to listen to my body and wanting to listen to what he wanted. So I did regret that, but it felt sort of like, I didn't necessarily have cesarean in my birth plan, and I really wanted to have a natural birth my whole life. So, and having one already, wanted to stick with that and just thought, let's give it a try.
Yeah. And so was that the point that they actually changed the conversation from, oh, it'll be fine, you'll turn, to, oh, actually, we need to do something, like that 37-week mark?
Yeah, I was sort of in the hospital right after that was unsuccessful, that I kind of had that conversation with my OB of, okay, what now? Due date is in 2 weeks. And I asked, is induction an option with Breech? And she just said no, and had said to me, it's going to have to be someone else that helps you from here on out if the baby still doesn't flip. And at that point, I had to take it upon myself to do my own research and find my own referral, and really just dive deep into educating myself on what are my options. Am I really just being presented with, this is all we can do? And that's when I realized that just the training and education on it is really severely lacking in at least the US. And it seems like a lot of parts of the world.
And so how did you go? You did your research. So what did you find? What did that look like?
I was fortunate. I actually have a lot of medical doctors in my family that I was able to tap into and just kind of get their opinion along the way. Of course, I didn't want too much noise, but they were able to help me look into some of the most recent research and articles that have come out and studies about physiological way to go about it and what the safest way is and who's, I guess, a good candidate for breech birth, which I really didn't like that language from day one. I really felt like this was being treated as a problem in what was a very healthy pregnancy up until that point, when in my mind it was a variation of a normal presentation. So that's when I really thought, okay, hold on, this is getting very medical at this point. And I had some sort of trauma from the induction with my first birth. It wasn't the easiest. It was very, very long birth, and obviously unnatural with Pitocin and the drugs that they give you to induce. So that's when I thought, all right, let's block it all out and figure out what I want. And that's when I started looking into midwives.
Okay. And are they home birth midwives, hospital-based midwives? What is their setting?
Yeah, they were home birth midwives. Yeah. I did look into, was it Breech Without Borders, and they were able to provide a directory of people in the US that were recommended licensed midwives. So I went through them, and there were really not many. It's kind of a desert where I live. So I had to travel a few hours down the road to meet these amazing women who were absolutely lovely and really normalized the whole thing for me and calmed a lot of my worries. What it really came down to was the sort of the travel time. I was a little bit worried about kind of packing up my toddler and getting everybody down the road in time.
How many hours did you say it was to get to them?
It was about 3 hours away.
Okay.
So not horrible, but I just kind of had this sense of I wanted to be close to home. And, what if we're in the car and things start progressing quickly? Also, when to go, when to just be there. Do we rent a hotel room or an Airbnb? What does that look like to just kind of uproot everything and be there for time comes? So at that point, I reached out to some of my family members who were in the medical community just to see if there was a Hail Mary of, do you have any referrals? Is there anyone like word of mouth that might be able to help me? I just felt more comfortable trying this in hospital, just in case anything were to go wrong. I just wanted to have that and not have to transport to a hospital somewhere down the road I wasn't familiar with, have all those uncertainties. So I did put together a very breathy email to the whole maternal and fetal medicine department of our hospitals and kind of blasted it out just to say, I'm 39 weeks at this point. I have a breech presentation. Is there anybody who is willing to help me? And I got passed on and passed on and passed on, and finally found this amazing who was he'd been around the block. He was a little bit on the older side. He had a little bit of training and familiarity with this. And he said, look, I'm willing to help you. At least come in and we'll talk and do a consultation. So I met with him and he was absolutely wonderful, really kind of calmed a lot of my fears and made me feel less crazy, less, I want to say, almost like guilty for wanting to do it this way. There was a lot of talk like risk and so much can go wrong and the head can get stuck and what happens if you're putting your baby at risk? Like, are you, being selfish in a way is what it felt like I was being told. And so he was amazing. He did have the ability to do it in hospital. However, he did tell me transparently that the hospital policy prevented him from doing a vaginal breech birth past 41 weeks. So that was sort of the timeline that I was a little bit worried about, especially since my first went, over 40. I just knew my babies like to stay cozy a little bit longer. So it was pretty amazing that he came at 40 plus 6 because we almost missed that cutoff. But one thing that was crazy that I asked is, what happens if I'm 40 plus 2 and I go into labor and I just, I show up at the hospital? What happens then? Like, am I given any options? And there was someone who actually said to me that they will push the baby back up into you and then give you the option to have a C-section.
Is that right? Without consent?
That was outrageous. I was like, that doesn't seem like that is even legal. So I kind of brushed that off and said, okay, well, try me kind of a thing.
Yeah. Good luck.
Of course, I wanted to do it the right way, and I'm kind of a rule abider in that sense. I wanted everything to kind of go as planned, and it ended up being okay. By one day, we missed the cutoff, and he was born beautifully and wonderfully.
You end up with the OB, and that was in the hospital that you're already attending.
This was actually a different
hospital. Okay,
yeah.
Still close to home.
Only 20 minutes.
Great. Yeah. Okay, and so. Did you end up having many appointments with him at all before birth?
Yeah, he did strongly suggest another attempt at an ECV. He wanted to have an epidural involved. He felt like that would really increase the chances.
For the ECV?
Yeah, because he had no medication for the first one. He had said, in my experience, they work a lot better when you're not sort of tensing up and you don't have that reaction to the, I guess, pressure, which is uncomfortable. And
interesting. I would have thought that would be more of a risk because you then can't tap into your body and what feels not right. There's a reason why you feel sensations in your body to communicate to you.
Yeah, I didn't really love that. At this point, we were going on 40 weeks and I was just feeling quite, I guess, desperate at that moment to where I did agree to it. And so on the due date, on the 40-week mark, went back in and just said, look, if this guy is my only chance to do this the way that I want to give birth, let's do what he wants me to do. At least I can show him that I respect his opinion and I'm willing to try. Of course, it was, again, unsuccessful. We had to do this one in the operating room because it was so close. It was the due date. There was a chance that I would just go into labor or that, there would be a complication and we'd have to go into emergency C-section. And, this one, the baby sort of budged more, but just like a rubber band kind of like snapped right back. And I could tell when I felt the large movement of him going back where he wanted to be, I cut it off. I was just like, nope. I knew that it's not going to happen and I didn't want to push it and go down that road of, now we're in an emergency situation and we've got to, take away your ability to decide what happens next. Yeah. I guess the only, not the only, but one of the more positive things that did come from the ECV, I'm fairly certain it did cause some of the early labor to sort of kickstart. I did lose part of my mucus plug later that night and just started having some Braxton Hicks sort of really right after that. So I'm not sure, it could have been a coincidence, but it did sort of seem like, okay, maybe my body was a little bit pushed to start doing its thing.
feeling the pressure. It's time to get going. So let's start with labour then. When it did start to kick off, what did that look like?
Yeah. So he was born on a Wednesday. It was the Sunday prior that I started having a lot more of those Braxton Hicks and just uncomfortable sleeping. A little bit more of the mucus plug was coming out a little bit at a time over that next day or two. And it would come and go. It was nothing super crazy, but I definitely felt like, okay, I'm getting some sort of like period cramps kind of a feeling, just uncomfortable. I wasn't as familiar with what exactly labor felt like because my first was an induction, but I knew that after doing my research, of course, there's an early labor stage. So I was paying very close attention as the time progressed, that Sunday and Monday. And then that Tuesday, really nothing was happening. Sort of just a normal day, went about, my chores, walking the dogs and hanging out with my toddler and cleaning the house, just kind of nesting, and reading. And then it wasn't until the following day, the day before he was born, where it really started ramping up and, still just contractions started getting a little bit stronger, in the nighttime, right before bed, the day before he was born. And they were still pretty far apart, 15, 20 minutes. I went to sleep as I usually do and woke up around 1:30 in the morning, just very uncomfortable. They started really getting stronger and closer together. So really that whole early morning from like 1:30 till about 6 a.m., just rolling around in bed, really just uncomfortable. It got to a point where I just had to stand up and walk around and just kind of started breathing through them early in that morning. It was when the sun came up that I remember just being like, okay, I think today's the day. And really just soon after that, they got closer and closer together. And at one point, just had such an urge to get in the bathtub. I was just like, these are really, really uncomfortable. I was getting shaky and getting to the point where I couldn't really even hold a conversation with my husband at that point. I kind of put him on notice and I was like, okay, let's get the bags loaded up and just plan for this to progress. So around 8 a.m. I got in the bathtub and I remember it just was like game changer. And it really kind of slowed the contractions down, almost to a point where I was like, oh no, should I have not gotten in the bathtub? Am I sort of
Savor that moment. Savor it.
Yeah. It was when I sort of got out and got dressed that they ramped right back up again, and it was very close together at that point. I was like, okay, we need to go. They were maybe 5 minutes apart and really strong. So we got in the car, got to the hospital around 11:30. At which point they checked me and said I was about 5 centimeters dilated already. And then about 30 minutes later, my water broke. And it was just kind of this really strong contraction that I was just kind of breathe through, sort of bending over and pop like a balloon all of a sudden. And there was some meconium in the water, which I was a little bit worried about, but they reassured me that that was a normal thing with the
Pretty
breech.
common with breech. Their bums, once they're in that pelvis, they get squeezed and squished and their bowel gets emptied.
Part of me was a little bit worried that that was maybe due to the stress of like one of the ECVs. I was a little bit worried that maybe we pushed on him too hard and it was a stress response or something like that. I was like, oh, was it that rubber band moment when he snapped back that he maybe released some meconium? I just couldn't help but worry that, of course, maybe something I did wrong. So that was around noon, and he was born at 2 p.m. So it was a very quick process after that. Once the water broke, really, really strong contractions. And they told me, now's your chance to change your mind. If you want to get a C-section, we have the paperwork right here. It was very much like, I could tell they were starting to get a little bit nervous. They were like, okay, she's really going to do this. We kind of thought she was going to back out. And one of the nurses was kind of funny. She was like, your email really circulated and you've been kind of the talk of the hospital. We don't do this. And just so you know, like all eyes are on you kind of a thing. And I was like, great, that's all I need right now is that pressure.
It's not what you need to be told in labor.
Yeah. Deep down, I really did want a home birth. It was really disheartening that I couldn't have that and it wasn't something I could find a midwife near me that would help with. So this whole thing was like my best attempt at, a physiological birth. And after a certain point, anyway, we're back having contractions and I'm just so uncomfortable and they're sticking the needle in me to try to give me an IV because I was GBS positive.
Oh, they're a bit slow to do that.
Yeah,
To do
it
that
was
earlier.
very late in the game and they couldn't get it in because I guess my veins were not cooperating and it was just added stress in that moment. Finally, they got it in only about an hour before I gave birth. But I'm, sitting on this ball, just going through them and just trying to close my eyes and block out all the noise. My husband, who's there, is huge support, just putting pressure on my back and talking to me, just like, you got this, you were made for this, like all the wonderful things that I needed to hear. So I really just honed in on him and they said, okay, well, you're enough dilated. I'm not sure if I was 7 or 8 centimeters at this point, but they were like, we have to get you to the operating room. You need to give birth in the operating room at this point because there's a high chance that we're going to have to go into a C-section. They were also sort of, I'm not sure, it was a little bit of a blur, but they were also sort of asking me, do you want epidural? Do you want this? You can sign these papers. We can give you medications. I very much did not want a medicated birth at all, just given the fact that my first one was so heavily medicated with Pitocin, and then I ended up getting an epidural, and it seemed to prolong the pushing stage a lot with the induction. And these contractions, these natural contractions, just felt different. They just felt a little bit more, as uncomfortable as they were, manageable because there were breaks in between. It was something new to me that I felt like I could get through.
Very different to an induction.
Oh yeah, much prefer obviously the natural ones. So we got to the operating room and only about 30 minutes later, he was born, but I remember that they rolled me to the operating room. I was on all fours on the bed because I was very determined to be upright. I was on my back for the induction, obviously, with my first, and I just wanted gravity to work with me. And I just had read the articles with some of these publications saying, with breech birth, it's really best to either be standing or on all fours and just listen to your body, kind of do the dance, work around the baby. The baby's going to do its thing. And I had spoken with the doctor and told him that was my plan, but I was stuck in that position. At that point, I was just kind of like, this is where I'm at. Roll me in. If you need me to be in the operating room for this, let's go. So we got in there and they were like, okay, you're 10 centimeters. Up until that point, I was fighting the urge to push because I had also been told it's very important with a breech baby to wait to push until you're a full 10 centimeters. Otherwise, I guess the risk of, the head entrapment can be increased if you push premature. That was something that I just kind of got in my head about this head entrapment thing. I don't know.
I'd love to just jump in there and just share, when we talk about head entrapment, we're talking about head entrapment in the cervix. We're more likely to see this in a preterm situation because their head circumference is larger than their body because they're not finished growing. Whereas with a term baby, like your baby, the stomach circumference and head circumference would have been very similar. So if the stomach and legs can come through, then the head will be able to come through. So unfortunately, it's still told to women in that setting, you're more likely to have head deflection when you're waiting for the birth of the head, which isn't in the cervix, it's in the vagina. And that's just about flexing the head. So I'd just like to explain that a little bit more in detail for the listeners.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think, sadly, when I look in hindsight, there was a bit of that fear mongering that was happening. I had to kind of advocate for myself to get the knowledge that I needed to question a lot of the things that I was being told in order to have it, I guess, be more convenient for everybody else. So, I know that, of course, there are situations that go wrong and there have been recorded risks and complications, and all of this has happened. I just wanted to sort of weigh those risks and understand how they actually pertained to me and be prepared for them, but also not get in my head about it because I just wanted to be in that mindset of, this is what I was created to do. I'm a woman. I have birthed a baby before. I can do this. What's the difference between, head down or head last? So I wanted that minimal intervention. I really wanted to go as natural as I could. And so, the pushing phase was pretty easy and natural. I was ready to push. So, I just sort of let it all happen. My body kind of did the job for me at that point. I think it was only about 20, 25 minutes of pushing. He came out butt first with his feet up. So I think it was like a frank presentation. Yep. And with every push, really, he was working with me. He was ready to be born, and I just welcomed him. And once his sort of butt came out, and then his feet came out one by one, his hands came out, his arms came out one by one. Everything was really working with us. There was really no effort from the doctor. They just watched and encouraged, which was nice. I really didn't want much intervention at all, unless, of course, necessary. And I think just at that point where he was just neck up in me, the doctor did kind of, I guess, put his hands under the belly just to support the baby. At that point,
you're still in upright position?
No, but at that point, the doctor, to my dismay, had requested that I get on my back. I very much was not happy about it. I remember being quite verbal and maybe not the most pleasant about it. This isn't what we agreed on. This isn't what I want. I'm very comfortable. What's the point? He's already moving out. They had just again made me fearful about there's higher risk. You need to get on your back. We can't see well enough to help or do maneuvers unless you turn over. So I think maybe it was just sort of the stress of the moment where he was so far out, and I just didn't want the head entrapment to be a thing. I just agreed and, got on my back, legs up. Very, very difficult to move around at that point. So there was like 5 people helping me, move my legs and get where I needed to be for them. And yeah, so he, just kind of put his hand under the belly and just kept him propped up while I pushed his head out, which was very quick and easy. Again, seemed very unnecessary because he probably would have just came right out.
Because you would have had gravity doing that.
Yes. So he was wonderful. He was a bit in like shock. His eyes were like bulgy and he wasn't moving around a lot. I was a little bit concerned in that moment because my first was very much an immediate crier and really moving around, and I wasn't hearing the cries, and I was just a little bit holding my breath like, okay, is everything all right? And I had read something about breech babies can be a little bit stunned in the moment, just because it's a little bit of a more rocky way to come into the world. But they put him sort of on my stomach for some skin to skin. And they were, rubbing him and giving him as much as possible to get him going and stimulated. I just remember being really curious. I was like, how long are we going to do this before he, snaps out of it, kind of a thing. And so it was maybe 15, 20 seconds that he was on me, and they were like very serious about, hey, we need to get him oxygen. We're worried that there's too much time passing. He's not, taking his own first breath. I'm here thinking, well, he's still on the umbilical cord, so he should still be getting oxygen, but he just wasn't getting, I guess, sort of the color that they wanted. I was just sort of, I don't want to cut the umbilical cord too soon. I want him to get all that blood. And again, this was part of the big conversation that the plan was to at least wait a minute or two for the, cord to turn white and him to get everything he needed. But they were like, we can't wait. He needs oxygen now. So I agreed for them to cut the cord, and they took him just in the room adjacent to me with my husband, and I could kind of see through the glass window that they were just giving him bag mask to get him sort of oxygen. And I saw his limbs moving around at that point, and he was awake and looking good. And so I was very much relieved, but very much honed in on what was going on over there. Maybe a minute passed before I got the thumbs up from my husband from the glass window, where I was like, okay, I can breathe now. He's okay. But it was a scary moment there, the first couple minutes after he was born. And yeah, so he ended up getting a little bit extra oxygen at that time. And it took, I wanted to deliver the placenta naturally as well, but there was a worry that maybe I was going to lose too much blood. So they kind of asked me if I wanted Pitocin to birth the placenta. And I very strongly did not want Pitocin again. I had said, I want to just contract and get, birth the placenta naturally. I know sometimes it can take a little bit longer. They were like, we just don't want you to bleed too much. We really want you to have the Pitocin. So I agreed to that. I said, I guess a small dose. If you really, it felt very rushed. Like if you really just need me to free up this OR,
Yeah,
fine.
that's what I'm thinking. They're just trying to sort you out so they can get you out of the OR.
Yeah. So, again, to my dismay, I did agree to that. And very shortly after, birth the placenta, and that was that. But yeah, the plan that you discuss versus the reality of what happens isn't necessarily the best. And that's why I think it's important for women to know that you really do have to advocate for yourself, and you really do have to think about, almost admitting yourself into a system where they might not really be looking out for your best interest. Obviously, their interest is to keep mother and baby healthy and doing well, but
I think their main focus is keeping you both alive in what they perceive is the best way, which is not necessarily woman-centered, baby-centered, or evidence-based.
Exactly. Yes. And that's another thing too with the cesarean conversation that I struggled with was, what if I want to have subsequent vaginal births? Or what if, there wasn't that conversation of what happens after the cesarean in the hospital. It was like, I have to ask you what the risks are. You're not just going to tell me what those are. Meanwhile, tell me all the risks of a vaginal breech birth, but I had to pry to get the answers on what the risks of a cesarean are, or even do my own.
Which is bias. So those listening, when you are getting the information, in order for you to be informed, you need the risks and benefits presented to you for all of your options, not just the ones that the health practitioner feels focused on, giving you the benefits of having a cesarean now versus how risky it would be for you to have a breech birth. And I really, really encourage women when they get told, oh, it's high risk, actually ask what the risk is. You can't just get told it's high risk. They need to provide you with what the stats are. And if they don't know what the stats are, then why are they providing that even as an option? They need to be competent and understanding and know what the risks are and the numbers and tell you that. And they need to be explaining what the risks for future pregnancies and babies for mother and baby if you have cesareans, because it can't just be focused on this one pregnancy and baby. It needs to be, if you're having more children, then yes, your risk does increase quite a bit more later.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. Informed consent is huge. And, I have nothing against cesarean births. I think there's absolutely a time and a place for them. And I know that they save lives and they're wonderful. But I also think that the rate of cesarean births going up so much in just the last 30 years is a bit concerning, because it shows that there's a little bit more of a biased trend happening, because it's not like there's more risk happening in the last 30 years than there has been for the last, thousands of years. It's a shift in the mentality and the training of that medical world. And, it's sad because I do feel like there's a lot of people that they're maybe not empowered to do their own research, or they just feel like they're sort of backed against a wall of, I trust this medical professional. This is the option that they're giving me. So this person in a white coat must just know all of the answers, and I'm just going to blindly go into it. But you do have to, I think, zoom out and think about what's of the best interest for the hospital and the person that works for the hospital versus you and what you want and you deserve, because this is one of the best days of your life, and you should be able to think back on it saying, no matter how it went, whether you did vaginal or cesarean, that you made your informed decision with all of the facts that were laid out on the table. So that's really what my approach kind of was from the beginning, and asking all of the questions. And I mean, I think I sat for hours in that hospital room talking with the OB that ended up helping me with the birth, just with all the questions and the back and forth. And, he didn't necessarily know all of the answers to my questions. We ended up having to do research together.
Which is great. That's a good sign of a good healthcare provider, if they can acknowledge that they don't know something and do the work with you rather than pretend to know and palm you off and avoid the answering.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have found someone who was willing to do that with me, because it just felt like a lot of people that, they were just more comfortable. Just let's schedule the cesarean at 39 weeks, bada bing, bada boom. We'll get it done. You're in, you're out. It's easier for me because it's on my schedule. And basically that was it. So it was very difficult. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult here in America as well with our medical system, because it seems like home births are not quite as common as they are in some other like European countries and probably Australia too. Midwives are more supported. I think they're maybe more revered. Here,
Yeah, sometimes.
yeah, from some of my research, it seemed like midwives were able, like if you have to transport at a home birth, like they were able to accompany you to the hospital, but not as midwives with hospital rights, but more as like, I'm your
Yes.
friend who's here for support.
Yeah, so some midwives don't have what we call credentialing here, where you would admit a woman into the hospital as a private patient and provide clinical care. So if they did transfer, they go in and they're still their midwife, but they're not providing clinical care in that setting. So it's more like having a doula there, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And even some of the state laws here in South Carolina, from speaking with the midwives that I met with, it almost felt like they had to go a little bit underground to do a breech birth at home. And, maybe don't shout it from the rooftops kind of a thing, because there was a lot of like legality involved. If something were to go wrong and you did a breech home birth, that it sounded like they could potentially get sued, was very upsetting to me, because they're wanting to help and they're actually trained in breech birth. I think the women that I spoke with had done nearly 200 breech at home births, which was very reassuring. I was so upset when I found out they couldn't come all the way to me, but still, nonetheless, if I were to get pregnant again, I think I would love to find a way to have an at-home birth with a midwife. It just felt like in my gut, especially having had 2 hospital births, that is the best way to really feel comfortable and seen and supported if all of the ducks are in a row.
Yeah. So knowing what you know now and having the experience that you've had, if you do fall pregnant again and you have a breech baby, would you do anything differently? You've kind of answered that, but I'll ask it.
Yeah, I think given that the hospital birth went sort of the way it did against some of the ways that I outlined I wanted it to go, for example, having to be on my back or having to get the Pitocin, and sort of the surprise of, the baby needs oxygen, kind of that real life risk happening with a very time sensitive moment. I did feel comfortable that I was in the hospital for that moment so that he could receive the oxygen that he needed. But I do know that like the midwives that I spoke with, they were equipped for those X factors to happen as well. They had, what I didn't realize is midwives have wonderful equipment and they have the oxygen ability to handle these things that occur. They don't just come empty handed. They're very well trained and
Trained medical professionals. That's their job.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I were to fall pregnant again, I would absolutely love to, now that I would have more time to plan for this problem to maybe occur, which I do not think a breech baby is a problem. I'm going to make that clear. I would find a way to have a midwife near me to help with a home birth. I think that would be the most beautiful thing. And yeah, that would be lovely to give that a try. As much as I appreciate the hospital system and what they're able to provide and how they support in many, many ways, just that system and being kind of a cog in what the rules and the timelines being to operate in their box was not ideal for me personally.
Yeah, fair enough. Before we finish up, do you have any words of wisdom or advice that you'd like to share with women listening who have a breech baby?
I guess just trust your gut, and try to listen to your own intuition along the way. There's a lot of stress that comes in anticipating giving birth, I think, especially for maybe a first-time mom, and just really being able to look inward and just come up with what do you really want for yourself and for your baby, because I really think it matters the way that a child comes into this earth. A birth plan is not always going to come out exactly as planned. It's more of a hope or an ideal situation. But I think if you're able to really ask yourself some of those difficult questions of what do you truly want and who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to let into your bubble at that very pivotal and crucial time? You're kind of your own advocate at that point. Hopefully you have a partner or a support system around you that can support you and not try to change your mind or add layers of fear that you don't need at that point in time. But yeah, I would just say no matter if you have a breech baby or not, just do your own research and make sure that you have a plan that's going to help you look back and say, that birth was how I wanted it, or even if it's not how you wanted it, you can be proud of how you made choices along the way up until the very end.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. You made the choices, not you were coerced or, yeah.
Yeah.
You're beautiful. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It was lovely.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I just want to say that your podcast helped me a whole lot along the way, and I hope that even I can help one person with my story.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Oh, thank you. It's nice to hear.
Really appreciate all you're doing.
Thank you for listening to the Breech Birth podcast. These stories matter. They stretch what we think we know and bring voice to experiences that need to be heard. I'm so grateful to the women who have shared their experiences with us, raw, real, and full of wisdom. If this episode resonated with you, please follow, share, or leave a review. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Breech Birth Podcast. And if you have a breech story to share, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, may we continue to reclaim the narrative, one story